All right, good morning, everybody. Honored to be here. Erica, congratulations. I'm going to talk on a new topic today, and it's really moving from sporadic outcome measurements to really a more continuous measurement, and we're going to focus on quality of life. This work has been led by Gabe Haboob, one of my partners at the Cleveland Clinic, and actually one of our now residents who did this work as a medical student thesis. And the central argument here is fairly simple. Recovery is not a single event. It unfolds over months, but when we measure recovery using patient-reported outcome measures, we do it with snapshots in time. And I'm going to walk you through why that's a potential problem, what drives variability we see in that process, and how we can do better using continuous estimation and trajectory-based classification. So here's the core problem, right? We collect PROMs at a handful of visits, right? But recovery is more like a movie, right? And we're looking at it as snapshots in time, 6 weeks, 3 months, 12 months. And our current sort of practice with this treats the known PROM score as the patient's health or the truth until we see them again. But between those visits, we assume that that health is staying unchanged, but in reality, recovery doesn't work that way. Patients fluctuate. We all know that. We see that. They get better. They get worse. They restabilize over time. But the label we give them using a PROM really depends on simply the time and point when we see them, and that's how we label them at that time. It also turns out that PROM completion in itself is not entirely random. We looked at a cohort of over 5,000 cases at the Cleveland Clinic, and only about 50% of patients actually completed their full PROM trajectory. And it turns out that the patients that drop out are systematically different. They tend to be racial minorities, they are typically uninsured, smokers, and from higher deprivation neighborhoods. So not only are the snapshots we're looking at somewhat unreliable, they're also inequitable. And in reality, the patients we probably need to track the most are the ones we're least likely to hear from. So that's another concern with how we're doing that. So now, but for the patients we are able to track, that 50%, what does their recovery actually look like if you unpackage it? And this is what it looks like, right? Patients fluctuate up and down in between the times we see them at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and they eventually do stabilize. And you're able to look at this in two different ways. You can look at some sort of change beyond an MCID from a baseline before a pre-op PROM, and that's really a reversal of a surgical effect to some extent. And you can also look at variability between visits, and that would be a sequential reversal of effect if they change within their MCID during that period of time. And that's really a visit-to-visit instability. And the key finding here for us, this is looking at a cervical myelopathy cohort, is that most of all of these reversals that we're seeing happen within the first 3 to 12 months of the postoperative period. And that's typically the time when we probably have the fewest data points we're actually collecting using at-visit PROM measures. The trajectories for this cohort tend to stabilize out to about 12 to 24 months. So you really still have that volatility until pretty long-term after care. So then you could ask, well, how common are these reversals that we see? And in fact, they're very common. Again, this is a 900-patient cohort of cervical myelopathy patients. You see that about 50% of those patients had at least one reversal of their surgical effect. So a change greater than their MCID based on their pre-op surgical visit. And 60% had variability between visits, so dropping greater than 10% MCID from visit to visit. So it's quite common. And these are the patients that we see this most often in the first 3 to 12 months, not stabilizing out to about 18 to 24 months. So naturally, you could ask, well, what's driving that variability, right? Is it a patient issue that drives all this volatility we see? Is it me as a surgeon, what I do? Is it my technique? And we tried to uncover that to some extent. So using this model, we were able to decompose outcome variance into its components, really at a basic level, right? Patient level factors, which could include BMI, smoking, mental health, other comorbidities, and surgeon-related factors. And then there was just some factors we couldn't account for in this model. And it turns out that patient-driven factors are driving all of this variability that we see. In fact, it's 48 times larger than the surgeon effect. And using simulation, we showed that reducing patient variability by just 10% significantly reduces outcome volatility, while changing the surgeon's variability really had no impact. And sort of what this implies clinically means that we could potentially modify some of these patient-related factors and reduce some of this volatility going forward. And our group is currently working at this question currently. Again, you could ask, is this just limited to cervical myelopathy? That's all I've shown you. And in fact, it's not. We looked across multiple surgical cohorts. This is all Cleveland Clinic data, and we see the same finding. There's significant variability across all of these, and it's very common with them. So now, even if you accept all of this, that there is this volatility and variability, you could say, well, at least we can define success of our surgeries, right? We all talk to our patients how successful this is going to be. We publish it, and because we think it's objective, right? But in reality, it may not be. And let me show you an example of that. So this is a heat map that's showing 30 different combinations of how you can define success. And let's just use MCID greater than 5 as a successful procedure. And what I'm showing in the rows are average post-operative PROMs at different time points. You can average them all. You can take the highest. You can take the lowest at any point. You can take it in 6 months or 12 months. And then the columns are time points when I collect a PROM before surgery to use it as my baseline. And you can see the wide-ranging percentage of success depending largely just on when you take that time point, right? This can range anywhere from 2% all the way up to 77% with this model. So when you have this, really the issue is that the sort of the definition is the result, right? So this is a problem. Now, one could ask, can't we just solve this with AI, machine learning, or something like this and solve this problem? Maybe it's just an algorithm issue, and that'll dissect through some of this noise. And in fact, that's been looked at, okay? So we did a systematic review. We looked at 35 studies that built predictive models for patient-reported outcomes in spine surgery, about half of them using machine learning. And you can see machine learning performs very well. But the interesting thing is the distributions between traditional regression models do overlap substantially. And when you try to externally validate them, they only performed at or below the 25th percentile. So I would argue here that the algorithm itself is not the bottleneck here, right? It's really the measurement framework we're using. You can't predict an outcome accurately when the outcome itself is defined inconsistently and measured with noise that rivals the signal. So our solution, or a solution I'm trying to propose to you today, is using a more continuous signal using estimation. So you can do this with sensor fusion using a Kalman filter. And this is the same algorithm used in spacecraft navigation. It allows you to fuse two data streams, right? Your high quality but sparse PROM data that you have for your patient, and also some other form. And for the purposes of this, we used healthcare utilization. So how the patient interacts with the healthcare system after your surgery, which is very dense data. It's very noisy. But using the Kalman filter, you can adaptively weigh each source of data based on its uncertainty. It can produce a continuous quality of life estimate with confidence bands, and automated risk alerts. And you can see how it performs in practice here. You can basically develop your model. You can set it up any way that you want. You can have your PROM input, your health utilization input for the sake of this. You can set threshold alerts. And then you can create a clinician dashboard that this feeds into, and it shows the patient's current quality of life estimate. It gives you a sense of the trend that they're going in, what the uncertainty is, and if there's any risk level in real time. And so third, if risk does arise with that patient through the system sends the patient a mobile check-in through an app. They may be prompted to fill out a survey. That data feeds back into your Kalman filter and updates your quality of life estimate in real time. So this allows sort of a tie-in of a measurement, which we make all the time, to some sort of clinical action, which is a new use of a measurement framework like this. So this captures data, continuous estimation, and timely intervention, and it really closes that loop between measurement and action. So now that we have a continuous signal, if you buy that, we need now a better way to define success. As I showed you the problem that we're doing now, MCID is snapshots in time, it misses volatility, and our framework is using mean variance classification. And what that uses is essentially, or it captures both an average level of improvement, but also measures its consistency. And you're able to classify patients better than a binary, success, no success, improved or not. You're able to classify them in different clusters, right? And you can do it based on their overall improvement and their volatility. And you can make some clinical judgment on this now. You can tie your measurement to a clinical output. So if I have a patient who has high gain and low volatility, I can sort of classify them into that recovery trajectory. And that's a patient maybe I don't need to see for 6 more months. If I have a patient that classifies into, say, high gain, high volatility, that's not somebody I want to wait for 6 months. I may want to see them in clinic earlier. And somebody who has low gain, high volatility, maybe I just need to rethink again my surgical operation here, or the patient I'm choosing, because those patients aren't doing very well. So this is really giving us both level and stability, and we can enable target clinical follow-up based on where they're clustering from a recovery standpoint. And we're able to do that now with this continuous model. So to close, I want to leave you with 5 messages. First, we now know that recovery is dynamic. We miss a lot of that using snapshots. Second, we can change our reported success simply by time points we choose, and there's a lot of variability in that. Patient factors seem to be driving that. We're trying to unpackage that currently to see what those patient factors are, but we may be able to mitigate some of that and reduce some of that volatility. Fourth, using a Kalman sensor fusion model, we can achieve an R-squared of 0.89, which is an accurate prediction of a quality of life metric in these patients. And we can predict a change potentially 30 days earlier than we use simply by using moving average, which is really basing what we think based on their last PROM score. And then fifth, using mean variance classification, we can create recovery phenotypes that we can put these patients in and have targeted clinical outputs based on what those phenotypes are. So again, I'd like to argue here that the trajectory here, at least in our opinion, is fairly clear. We can move from static snapshots in time to a continuous signal of patient recovery. We can now have risk-adjusted phenotypes, and that allows us to really design proactive and personalized care. Thank you very much.